Hi and welcome to the Geek Legion of Doom. This is a horror movie review and we'll be talking about Resident Evil. So Resident Evil, obviously based on the popular video game by Capcom. Now this actually is the beginning of a fairly long film franchise that stars Milla Jovovich as Alice. And it was one of these films that was obviously based on a video game but kind of did their own thing with it. And this is kind of both enraged and pleased sort of fans in equal measures to a certain degree, because it's obviously not telling the actual story of the game, it's merely borrowing elements from it and sort of going with their own original story. Now, that can, I suppose, be seen in one of two ways. I actually quite like the fact that they did that rather than just a retelling of the original story in Resident Evil, because it's kind of, it means it's something you haven't really seen before. But I do understand the criticism, obviously, that if you're going to see a Resident Evil film, you kind of want it to be really more or less a retelling of the story that you've seen and actually are expecting. So anyway, in case you don't know the story of the film version of the Resident Evil, it's basically it tells the story of a evil corporation called Umbrella, and they're this massive sort of multinational company that is kind of doing various sort of different experiments. And they have this kind of sort of underground facility whilst they're working on some kind of contagion, and ultimately it gets out and sort of causes everyone to sort of turn into zombies ultimately, and various other creatures as we find out a bit later on. And the actual facility itself is actually sort of controlled by a kind of artificial intelligence, if you like. It shuts the facility down, so the story really focuses on Alice. And she's basically an employee of the Umbrella Corporation, but she kind of loses her memory when the actual outbreak starts to happen. And then she's joined by a kind of team of sort of military types. I don't think they're actually the military. They're actually sort of employees of like a attack team from the Umbrella Corporation to try and find out what's happened and investigate what's happened. So we get the descent into the facility through the various different levels. There they come across a variety of different horrors caused by this virus that's escaped, and there she meets another guy who may or may not be on her side or not, who's kind of, she thinks maybe he's possibly even her husband. I won't go too much more into the plot other than that in case you haven't seen the film, and I wouldn't spoil it for you. In the video game adaptation, it was more or less set in this kind of big mansion. And although there is a mansion in this film, the actual majority of the action takes place in this underground facility. So again, there's changes there. There are some familiar characters from the game series, but they're more peripheral characters rather than the actual main character. Now, I have to say, so out of all the films that have been made on Resident Evil, my opinion is that this film is probably the closest to the game, although it is quite a major departure even saying that. Now, as a horror film, I actually do think it kind of works. Yes, there are some kind of CGI monsters and stuff, and then it isn't a particularly gory film, but there's plenty of zombies, and I actually think, you know, they come across as quite a decent enough threat where you're kind of fearing for the character's safety. And because Alice really isn't in part of the main sort of cast in the games, you don't really know what's going to happen to her. In this film franchise, she kind of goes on this quite a big sort of story arc where she finds out that she ultimately herself is kind of going to get genetically modified and things like that, and ends up kind of becoming a bit more of a meta-human. But the film, the actual first film is more a kind of straight horror film, whilst the later films tend to go off in a bit more of a kind of sci-fi edge. Now, the interesting thing with this franchise is the Resident Evil in the later games is kind of been shunned a little bit in regards to its sort of quality. And a lot of people think, well, maybe you should almost sort of combine the two and actually have Alice sort of join the actual games. Now, I would say this: if you're a horror fan and you're not really a gamer, I think you will still get a kick out of this film. I personally think the first Resident Evil film is probably the best out of the series. I know a lot of people kind of like the third one, but I think the first one is probably still the best, purely because I think it's probably the most traditional in regards to the sort of setup of a horror film, and because it's the first time we've seen the Resident Evil zombies and things like that, and every film after that almost tries to up the ante that much more, and it kind of gets a little bit too ridiculous. But the first one I think is a solid, maybe not a spectacular horror film, but it's a solid one. I quite like Milla Jovovich as a sort of female action hero. So I think she does a decent enough job, and she's obviously quite passionate about the project. So, you know, my hat off to her for sticking with it. I quite enjoy the franchise. I appreciate it's not particularly the best and most original films made out there, but nevertheless, I think it's a bit of a guilty pleasure. And it does decent numbers in the box office, so, you know, obviously I'm probably not the only person that thinks that. Do I think it's an amazing piece of cinema? No, I don't. Do I think it's one of the best horror films that I've seen? Not at all. Look, you know, you're looking from a bit more, just a bit of a time waster, and you kind of want to have a sort of more mainstream sort of type of zombie film than you probably get. You know, you can do worse than this one. So I'm going to give this one a 6 out of 10. I actually quite enjoyed this film. It's not one of my favourites, but I certainly, you know, it's certainly a film I've watched a couple of times, and it's definitely one I'm going to sort of keep hold of and probably watch again in the future. So there you go, 6 out of 10 for me. Have you seen it? What's your favourite Resident Evil film? And do you think they should make a game including Alice? Or do you think they should make a film really just based on the actual games themselves? I actually think I would like to see a film adaptation of the Resident Evil 4 story, but that's about the only one. But that could be almost a completely standalone film, I think. So anyway, 6 out of 10 for me. I enjoyed it. Go check it out if you've not seen it. Let me know what you think. Bye for now.